perception people had of him.
Susan certainly looked the part.
Susan had the boobs to hilt and the high heels.
And in a town like Peru, it was perhaps inevitable the two ended up together.
He enjoyed the finer things in life, was known to like a cocktail, cute girls.
There was an instant attraction.
He found her quite exciting.
But when Jim Grund is shot dead in August of 1992, authorities find themselves asking, had the former prosecutor strayed too close to the edge?
Authorities looked into people that Jim had put away as a prosecutor.
Or had Jim and Susan's instant attraction turned fatal? Like many mothers, Susan Grund spent the evening of August 3, 1992, hauling kids around. Son Jacob was spending the night at a campground with friends. Meanwhile, with her big brother gone, daughter Tanel was hosting a sleepover for her cousin.
Susan Grund walked into the house after having brought the girls home, walked in, thought that her husband initially was asleep.
When I called out, he didn't respond.
It was late, and Jim had been out to dinner with his brother-in-law, Fred.
So I thought, well, maybe they had one too many to drink. Sometimes when he would go meet Fred, they would drink a little bit.
I'd asked Mom if I could kiss Dad goodnight, and she didn't want me to because she said he was sleeping.
Susan sat the 7-year-olds down in front of the TV. Then she went upstairs where Jim Grund was sprawled out on a couch in the couple's bedroom. But he wasn't asleep or drunk.
The next thing we heard was Mom crying upstairs.
He'd been shot.
The bullet has traveled through his eye, through his brain, out the back of his head and into the sofa.
A prominent attorney shot dead in his own bedroom. The crime left police scrambling for a suspect.
He was a prosecutor. He was an attorney. He probably had a lot of enemies.
But had the killer come from Jim's past or Susan's? Jim Grund first met Susan on a blind date in June of 1984. But he wasn't blind for long. He knew right away that Susan came with baggage.
Had a lot of past and a lot of baggage. So I actually went overboard in telling him everything about me.
Originally from Peru, Indiana, Susan had left home in 1975. Only 17, she'd run off to Oklahoma with her first husband, Ronnie Lovell.
He played in a band, and he was just exciting.
If you're a rock and roller, you're supposed to have pretty women hanging on your shoulder, and Susie fit the bill.
Ronnie wasn't the only shoulder Susan had hung on to in those days either.
Infidelity was commonplace among all the bands. We just traveled the circuit, and we slept the circuit.
Susan and Ronnie divorced in 1979. A second short marriage to a construction worker named Gary Campbell produced a son named Jacob.
We decided to get a divorce, and she gained custody of my son.
By 1982, Susan had remarried, but that marriage, her third, ended when Susan was accused of beating her stepson. The boy's father filed for divorce, and Susan faced criminal charges. Although in the end, prosecutors cut a deal and allowed her to plead no contest.
The prosecution, it seems, didn't feel that they had a strong enough case.
Susan received probation for the child abuse charge. However, the charges did cost Susan custody of her son.
One day I got a call from the DHS office, and they had said they took my son Jacob away from Susan.
In the summer of 1984, Jacob went to live with his father, and Susan went back home to Peru. She was broke, alone, and pregnant.
After she had left her third husband, she'd had a brief relationship with another man.
All of her resources were exhausted. She doesn't have a husband. She's been essentially found guilty of child beating. So the only thing to do is to return home and regroup.
And within weeks of arriving, a chance encounter would set Susan on a path for Peru's social pinnacle.
Suddenly, through a friend, comes the offer of a blind date.
A recently divorced attorney and single dad named Jim Grund sounded like a hot prospect.
Jimmy was a third-generation lawyer.
She called me and told me she met Jim, and she was just so excited about him, and Jim was a wonderful man.
Jim was bigger than life, just a brilliant attorney.
Jim was 10 years Susan's senior, but he didn't act like it.
Jim liked to live on the edge. He flew airplanes. Jim liked to ski. He was pretty good at partying at times.
He enjoyed the finer things in life, was known to like a cocktail, cute girls.
The blind date with Susan had started out as a joke on the part of Jimmy's friends.
They're telling Jimmy she's pretty hot. What Jim didn't know is that this attractive lady was pregnant.
But when the pair met, the supposed joke backfired.
He didn't stop looking at me or talking to me the entire evening. So we knew that there was an instant attraction upon first meeting.
The attraction was mutual.
When I placed my hand in his, it was just there, immediately when we looked at each other.
Soon they were dating. And by the time Susan's daughter Tanel was born in October, things were turning serious.
He was running around looking like a proud papa when Tanel come into this world.
Barely a month later, he officially became Tanel's stepfather.
Jim called my mother and told her that they had gone to Florida and gotten married.
We had a beautiful wedding out on the water, and we honeymooned there in Florida. We just traveled around the Keys.
By the end of the year, Jim and Susan were back in Peru, where she soon settled into life as the wife of a prominent attorney.
Susan became a part of Jim's lifestyle of having a nice place to live, nice cars to drive, nice people on a higher level to go out with, have dinner with. Really, it was Jim inviting her into his life and family and her sharing those benefits.
Jim's family wasn't quite so welcoming, particularly his teenage son, David.
As with any child, when their parents are divorced, he wasn't real accepting of the relationship.
People around Peru couldn't help but notice the difference in Jim and Susan's ages either.
Jim and his trophy wife was the perception people had of him. I don't think many of the wives cared a lot for Susan.
Susan turning their husbands' heads didn't help either.
She had the boobs to hilt and the high heels. She would dress in all these frilly outfits, very revealing. No matter where she was the center of attention, and she made sure that she was.
Jim and Susan were also as close as Peru came to jet-setters, even if Jim's plane was only a Cessna. And the couple made frequent flights to Oklahoma to see Susan's son.
Him and my mother would fly down and come get me, and I made several trips back and forth from Peru to Oklahoma.
But did Jim know why Susan had lost custody of her son? According to his friend Bruce Embry, he did.
Jim did know about it. If Jim was satisfied with her, I wasn't going to delve into it to any great extent.
So on one visit to Oklahoma, Jim made a proposition to Gary Campbell, the boy's father.
Jim suggested to Gary that we could take care and regain custody of Jacob, and he wouldn't have that burden on him anymore.
Campbell agreed and signed the paperwork Jim had drawn up. Although according to Campbell, he was also under the mistaken impression that the arrangement was temporary.
After that year was up and I was well on my feet and I was trying to get my son back, well, they had changed his name and there's nothing I could do about it.
Jim formally adopted Jacob. His relationship with his biological children, on the other hand, had become increasingly strained on account of Susan. The teenagers were less than pleased with their new stepmother.
We always laughed because they called her the step monster.
David Grund, in particular, appeared to be especially upset by the way his father carried on with Susan.
They were huggy, you know, she would come over and sit on his lap, and sometimes it was a little much for us to take.
The man just doted on me. I felt like a princess all the time.
Jim also spoiled his 2 stepchildren.
Life was really good in Peru. We never wanted for anything.
Dad always gave me whatever I wanted.
Susan gave herself pretty much whatever she wanted, too.
She liked to be high fashion.
Every time we went out together as couples, I always felt very inferior because she had all these glamorous outfits.
Jim certainly appreciated how his wife looked, but he was less thrilled about how much she spent.
There was a few occasions that I seen Jim and Susan fight. I believe it was over money because she was spending too much.
Susan's spending wasn't all the couple fought over either.
Susan was known to be flirty and perhaps even a bit sleazy.
But did she do more than flirt? The gossips around Peru certainly thought so.
It's been rumored that she has had affairs with lawyers, doctors, very influential people that were very close with Jimmy.
By 1992, fights between Susan and Jim had become a regular occurrence, and there were signs that their marriage was coming apart.
There was an incident where they were fighting, and she made me help her move stuff down to the basement, and she asked me, how would you feel if Jim and I got a divorce?
The last blow-up between Jim and Susan came at the end of July, during a family vacation to Alaska.
I don't know what the fight was about, but my mother was yelling, and she told us, pack your bags, we're flying back home.
Jacob and Tanel did as their mother told them. By the time they were packed, however, Susan had calmed down. The family flew back home as planned together. But Susan and Jim's days at the pinnacle of Peru's jet set were numbered. 2 nights later, during her daughter's sleepover, Susan Grund walked into her bedroom and saw her husband sprawled upon a sofa.
He's relaxed. He's laying as if napping or asleep.
She shook him, trying to wake him up. And all she said she noticed was on one side of his mouth was light little drop of blood.
Susan dialed 911. But when the paramedics arrived, it quickly became obvious that Jim Grund wouldn't be going to the hospital.
They told me they had to take him. And I didn't want him to. They told me it was too late.
Coming up, was the killer someone Jim put away?
I had a conversation with the sheriff about a young man that came to mind.
Or was it someone he took in?
I went as far as them looking in my locker for a gun.
A little before midnight on August 3rd, 1992, paramedics arrived at the Peru, Indiana home of Jim and Susan Grund. Moments earlier, Susan had called 911 and reported finding her husband, a prominent local attorney, unconscious on the sofa.
From a distance, he looks fine and appeared to be napping or at rest.
But Jim Grund wasn't napping. He was dead, killed by a gunshot to his left eye.
The bullet has traveled through his eye, through his brain, out the back of his head and into the sofa. And there's no reviving him.
And when the first police arrived on the scene moments later, word of Jim's death quickly spread throughout the small town. Bruce Embry, Jim's friend and a county judge, was among the first to hear.
I got a call from Will Siders, who's the prosecuting attorney, saying that he was at Jim Grund's house and there was a need for the execution of warrants. That's what's going on.
Informed of Jim's death, Embry headed to what was already becoming a crowded crime scene.
There were a lot of people that had no relevance to a crime scene investigation. Family, business associates, civic leaders that were there that just did not need to be there.
Jim was so closely connected to the county's legal authorities, in fact, that the Indiana State Police quickly stepped in and took the lead in the investigation.
Detective Bob Brinson from the Indiana State Police exhibited his authority over Miami County and over Peru Police to take control of the crime scene.
Out of an abundance of caution, the prosecutor wanted warrants before they searched anything in the house. So in the garage, we took testimony under oath, tape recorded it, and I issued warrants for the search of parts of the house.
Investigators also tried to take a statement from Susan, but she appeared to be so shaken by the discovery of her husband's dead body that she had little to offer.
And there I was, all by myself with 2 small children, and my husband is dead. Everything becomes just horribly, just frantic at that point.
She just kept saying that she didn't know how this could happen or didn't know who could have done this.
Police didn't know either, but a quick search of the bedroom suggested an intruder.
There were drawers that were pulled open in their bedroom, and clothes were kind of all messed up.
If an intruder had shot Jim Grund, however, police were unable to determine how he or she had gotten into the bedroom.
Police first looked for any point of forced entry, garage, house, front door, back door, and found none. So it was puzzling to them how someone could have come in and done this.
Had a door been left unlocked? If so, police were still left wondering who could have harbored a grudge against Jim Grund.
Authorities looked into people that Jim had put away as a prosecutor. They didn't find anyone that fit the profile or could have been there.
Running out of candidates for an intruder, police began to ponder another possibility. Was there no forced entry because the killer didn't need to break in? On the morning of August 4th, investigators started taking a closer look at the Grund family, starting with Jim's widow.
I went to the police station to answer questions, to tell them exactly what everyone had done all day long and anything that I could offer to help.
Then she mentioned something else, something that caught the investigators' attention. Susan suggested that police take a closer look at her stepson.
David and his father argued all the time. They never had a meeting where something didn't happen.
Did David have a motive to kill his father? Did he have the means? A quick check of state records revealed that the 21-year-old had recently acquired a 9mm handgun. Odder still, he'd reported it stolen just 1 month before his father's death.
On the 4th of July, 1992, David Grund reports that his apartment's been broken into and that his gun has been stolen.
Brought in for questioning, David had a ready explanation. He told police his father had known all about the gun and the subsequent theft.
He had told his dad, Jimmy, that he had gotten a handgun and the permit would probably come to their house. And he told his dad, will you let me know when the permit comes in?
But when the permit arrived, according to David, it was Susan who brought it by the apartment.
Susan took the permit, went out to David's house the afternoon of July the 4th and said, hey, your gun permit came to the house. Let me see. Can I see the gun?
David told police he'd taken the pistol out of a dresser drawer, shown it to his stepmother, and then returned it to its hiding place.
When David and his girlfriend got home that evening, the house had been broken into, the screen was slit, the gun was gone.
Which one of the Grunds was telling the truth? Was Susan trying to divert attention from herself? Or was David trying to steer police back towards his stepmother? Only one thing was certain. David's information sent police on a frantic search for the murder weapon.
They even had helicopters involved with some kind of metal detectors looking for the gun. They looked in the river, they looked everywhere they could think of to look.
It even went as far as them looking for a gun in my locker or my book bag.
While police searched for the murder weapon, Peru was pondering the bigger question: whose finger had been on the trigger?
The buzz around Peru in Miami County was, she did it. That's what people were saying in restaurants and cafes and after hours at the bars.
At Jim's standing room only funeral on August 6th, no one came right out and accused Susan of murder. But she got the message regardless.
There was a visitation line for the Grunds, and there was a line for her, and no one was in her line. Because at that point, Everybody in town already formed their opinion.
The police, however, weren't so sure.
They questioned David extensively.
Determined to find his father's killer and clear himself in the process, David cooperated with the investigation.
He told them where he had fired the gun. They dug the slugs out of whatever it was, telephone pole or wherever he had fired it.
The slugs, along with the fatal one recovered from Jim and Susan's bedroom sofa, were sent to the crime lab for comparison. While the authorities waited for the results, they started digging into Susan's past. One thing immediately jumped out at them: Susan's child abuse charge from 10 years earlier.
As I read the file, I realized this child had been abused very extensively.
Susan had pled no contest, and even if she was capable of child abuse, Indiana authorities would need more evidence to prove she was capable of murder. On August 12th, the state crime lab confirmed that Jim Grund had been killed by his son's gun.
The police lab was able to match those slugs with the slug that killed Jim Grund.
And as David had already told police, Susan knew where he'd kept the gun. In fact, he'd shown it to her only hours before it had allegedly been stolen from his apartment. But did that mean Susan had shot Jim? Or was her stepson setting her up?
I never thought I would be a suspect. I thought that David would be implicated. It was highly suspicious that he bought the gun, and within a matter of weeks, he reports it stolen.
Coming up, will police find the missing gun? And if so, where?
Susan calls her sister and asks her, did they find it?
For years, Susan Grund had been the hot topic for gossip in the small town of Peru, Indiana. Married to the town's most prominent attorney, a man 10 years her senior, Susan's flirty ways and rumored affairs had kept Peru buzzing. And the buzz only intensified when Jim Grund was found shot dead in his own bedroom.
There were so many fingers pointing towards Susan.
They were on a witch hunt for me. They didn't even try to camouflage it.
By the end of the month, the accusing look she got all over town had become too much to bear.
Mother told me she was going to kill herself because she couldn't take the pressure anymore.
Susan loaded her children, Jacob and Tanel, into the car and drove to her mother's house 4 hours away in Vincennes, Indiana. Settling in temporarily, Susan hired a probate attorney and prepared to battle her stepchildren over their father's will. Jim Grund had amended the document less than a month before his death, and he'd apparently done it at Susan's request.
Jacob had not been in the prior will that he had written, only Tanel was in there.
And Jim, according to his sister Jane Allen, made the changes begrudgingly. The marriage was in trouble, torn apart by frequent arguments over finances and infidelity. But Jim didn't want Susan's constant nagging about the matter to sour their Alaska trip.
When he rewrote the will at the law office, the secretary said, "Are you sure you know what this will is reading?" And he said, "Yeah, I know. She wants me to change it before this trip to Alaska, and when we return, I will change it back."
Jim Grund never had the chance to undo the changes to his will. He was dead within days of returning from Alaska. Was the timing mere coincidence? His family didn't think so.
She could take off with the money, live happily ever after, and go find husband number 5.
Was that Susan's plan? Peru police soon had reason to think so. On November 2nd, 1992, Susan's sister Darlene contacted the authorities with a crucial piece of evidence. It was a conversation she'd had with her sister shortly after Susan had moved to Vincennes.
Darlene was living in their house in Peru. Susan had asked her to go to the house and protect it while she was gone.
But when Indiana State Police showed up one day with a warrant, there was little Darlene could do to stop them. She did, however, get word of the search to Susan.
Susan calls her sister and asks her, did they find it? She says, what do you mean? And she says, the gun.
That wasn't the end of Darlene's story either. To Susan's relief, Darlene had told her the police left empty-handed. And that's when, according to Darlene, Susan's behavior became even more suspicious. Within hours, Susan had rushed back to the house in Peru. And she'd come, according to her sister, for the gun that police had failed to find.
There'd been a feverish search for the weapon itself all over the house, and they missed it.
But little did they know, the gun had been hidden in the house the whole time.
The weapon was actually hidden by Susan Grund in a teddy bear at her and her husband's house in Peru.
Susan retrieved the teddy bear, and then the sisters had driven back to Vincennes together. Darlene said she never actually saw the gun, but during the drive, according to Darlene, Susan had explained what was going on.
Susan's in the car with Darlene and confesses to her that she shot Jim.
Of course, being Susan's sister, the poor thing, she didn't know what to do with the information.
Darlene said that after 2 agonizing months, she decided to come forward and betray her sister's trust. Now the challenge for investigators was, if Susan had confided in Darlene once, would she do it again? And could they get it on tape?
The police wired Darlene, and they went down to Vincennes.
With police listening in, Darlene dropped by her mother's and confronted her sister about the shooting. But this time, Susan not only denied killing Jim, she denied ever confessing in the first place.
I said, I don't know why you're saying this. So why are you saying this? Because I didn't say that to her.
One of the sisters was lying, and the Indiana State Police were pretty sure they knew which one. On November 2nd, they presented an Indiana judge with Darlene's statement about Susan's alleged confession, David's missing gun, and the changing of Jim's will. At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, fresh off the judge's desk, the police were back in Vincennes with the warrant for Susan Grund's arrest.
Mom and I shared the same room, and I was sleeping, and I just remember policemen barging into the room, and they took her.
4 hours later, she was back in Peru, being booked on first-degree murder charges.
It was 3 months almost to the day. We were very sure that she had done it, and that was the break that they needed.
But would it be enough? The attempt to back it up with a taped confession had failed, but there was still one piece of evidence that could confirm Darlene's account. While Susan was settling into the Miami County Jail, investigators in Vincennes searched her mother's house for David's missing 9mm.
They tore the house apart looking for a gun.
They didn't find the gun, or the teddy bear Susan had supposedly hidden it in. And the lack of a murder weapon wasn't the only hurdle standing in the state's way as Susan's trial approached. Susan's lawyer, Charlie Scruggs, filed for a change of venue, arguing Susan couldn't get a fair trial in Peru, where the Grunds had been prominent attorneys for generations. The motion succeeded, but only partially. The trial would take place in Peru, but before an outside judge and jury.
The jurors were drawn from Warsaw, which is 20, 30 miles away from Peru. So there was some detachment there.
Would it be the break Susan needed? After all, other than her sister's statement and a wiretap conversation that proved fruitless, the case against her was largely circumstantial.
Based on motive and the statements of her sister, law enforcement have enough to make a case against Susan and bring her to trial, but they don't yet have the murder weapon.
Then, in August of 1993, with her trial scheduled to begin in little more than a month, a second member of Susan's family contacted the state police. This time, it was Susan's own mother.
Susan's mother, Nellie Sanders, finds this old wash tub that has been around for some time.
The tub, as Nellie Sanders told police, had gone missing almost a year earlier when Susan moved in after Jim's death.
Nellie had asked Susan what happened to that big heirloom, and Susan told her, oh, it was old and ugly, and I just threw it away.
Therefore, as Susan's mother explained to police, she'd been surprised to find the tub in her attic nearly a year later.
There at the top of the steps was this big old family heirloom pot.
Odder still was what she had found in it. The tub was filled to the brim with concrete. Thinking something was peculiar, Nellie picked up the phone and called the police. And as soon as the conversation was finished, detectives drove out to Vincennes to investigate the find.
When they break open the cement, they find a handgun.
Not just any gun, either.
When they clean the handgun and can read the serial numbers on it, they find that it is the gun that was stolen from David Grunn's apartment.
Coming up, Susan's testimony raises new questions. Had she hidden the gun to protect herself or the true killer?
Jim had gone on a trip, and while he was gone, we went out dancing and drinking, and it began that night.
On the morning of September 27, 1993, Susan Grund walked into a Peru, Indiana courtroom to stand trial for her husband's murder. As usual, she turned quite a few heads, but this time the crowd in the courtroom did a double take.
She essentially dressed like a very conservative librarian or widow in black, very dressed down for her persona, and it was quite unexpected.
Prosecutor Will Sider's opening statement, on the other hand, focused on Susan's usual personal appearance, the over-the-top trophy wife Peru was used to. He described the defendant as a woman unwilling to give up the flashy clothes and fancy lifestyle she enjoyed as a lawyer's wife.
Prosecutor's theory was that her husband was going to file for divorce soon, that she was afraid of losing the financial benefits of being married to him, and that she had financial benefits to gain by killing him.
But was Susan the only person with a motive to murder Jim? According to the defense's open, Jim's son David had a motive.
The theory of defense was he had motive to commit the offense, or at the very least to lie about her involvement.
And the reason the defense gave stunned the entire courtroom. David wasn't just Susan's stepson. According to the defense, the 23-year-old had also been her lover.
Susan, in her own defense, put David forward not only as a suspect, but as someone that had had an affair with her.
The Grunds almost had a heart attack. I really think so. They were like, oh, no, 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 no.
Had David Grund killed his father in a jealous rage? And when the police started asking questions, did he point the finger at his stepmother as a diversion? Prosecutors discounted the possibility, showing Susan had plenty of opportunity to commit the crime. That afternoon, during testimony from Indiana State Police investigators, they presented jurors with an elaborate timeline tracking Susan's movements the evening of the murder. Shuttling Jacob to a campsite, coming back home, only to leave again to pick up her daughter and niece for a sleepover back at the house.
They were trying to track her whereabouts down to the minute.
Her 2 trips, according to the prosecution, had left Susan enough time to slip home and shoot Jim.
The state argued that Susan Grund had sufficient time to get from where she had dropped the kids off out to her and her husband's home, commit the act, and then get back to where the kids were.
Prosecutors also claimed that Susan had access to the murder weapon. Calling her stepson David to the stand, he testified that he'd shown Susan the 9mm handgun just hours before it went missing on July 4th, 1992.
His testimony was important to the state because it established Susan Grund had knowledge of where the handgun was located in his home.
But was it the truth? During cross-examination, Susan's attorney questioned her stepson about the alleged affair.
David Grund denied any type of intimate relationship with Susan Grund.
It was, according to Susan, a lie.
David Grund got on the stand and thought he was Bill Clinton, and I knew exactly how Hillary Clinton felt or Monica Lewinsky felt too, when she was sitting there listening to somebody deny something. If you're denying something that adamantly, if you're lying about it, you're hiding something.
But if David was lying and he was the shooter, how did his gun get to Susan's mother's house? On September 29th, Nellie Sanders, Susan's mother, took the stand and told her story about the tub full of concrete in her attic. The tub where, according to the prosecutors, Susan had hidden the murder weapon beneath a layer of concrete.
You could see in her the anguish of telling it and getting it out.
The same was true the next day when Susan's sister Darlene took the stand.
Darlene was nervous and quiet, but you could get the sense that she knew the facts and knew that they needed to come out.
And the facts, as Darlene told them, were damning.
She told us Susan had talked about the killing and that she needed help in moving the gun.
It was devastating to sit there and watch Darlene saying, I confessed to her.
Susan had reason to be devastated. Not only were her mother and sister's statements strong evidence for the prosecution, they'd also led police to the missing gun.
There are two family members that are the least likely people in the world to make up anything. They don't want Susan to be guilty.
With her own family testifying for the prosecution, Susan had few people to turn to. When the defense started presenting its case later that afternoon, Charlie Scruggs called Susan to the stand.
He didn't call any defense witnesses. It was just her up there by herself.
In tears, she described finding Jim's dead body. But it wasn't all she claimed she'd found that night.
I looked down, and there by his hand is the gun. Not knowing what it was, what was going on, I grabbed up the gun and the phone at the same time to call for help.
But before the police arrived, Susan said she'd realized who the pistol belonged to. Panicking, she'd hidden it.
I honestly thought I was protecting David.
Next, Susan admitted that the rumors around town were true. She did sleep around.
I did. I had other affairs over a course of several years, possibly.
And she claimed her affair with David had started one night while his father was out of town.
He took a yearly trip to Canada to go fishing. And while he was gone, we went out dancing and drinking, and it began that night.
And it continued for about 2 years, according to Susan, up until the time Jim was murdered.
She painted a very believable tale of passion and clandestine meetings and lovemaking.
But would the jury believe it? Were Susan and her stepson having a torrid affair? Could David have killed his father out of jealousy? And did that explain why Susan had hidden his gun? On September 30th, the jurors retired to consider a verdict. Several hours later, at 1:30 a.m., they returned to the courtroom. But they didn't return with a verdict. Instead, they announced they were deadlocked.
It's a late hour, and you really don't expect anything to come back other than guilty. So hopelessly deadlocked was really kind of a surprise.
Susan would soon face a second trial, and this time around she felt hopeful she would be able to convince an entire jury of her innocence.
In your mind, you want to think that they really won't find you guilty for something that you didn't do.
Susan would have plenty of time to think. She spent 5 months in jail awaiting her second trial. When proceedings started on March 7, 1994, in front of another out-of-town jury, the prosecution's case was essentially a repeat performance.
The state said, given the motive, given the opportunity, and then finally, given the fact that the weapon was found in her residence, those were all circumstances pointing to her guilty.
But when it was the defense's turn, the case took a very different course.
The judge made her refrain from saying a lot of the things that she wanted to say. They told her that she couldn't.
They wouldn't let me speak to the jury as I had the first time.
One thing in particular was strictly off limits. Although Susan did take the stand, she didn't make any mention of her alleged affair with David. And why not? According to Susan, her lawyer advised against it, caving under pressure from Jim's influential family.
I watched the Grunns close ranks in around their wayward grandson.
They just wasn't going to allow it.
Or was there another, easier explanation?
It's simply not true. It's too outlandish to be messing around with his older stepmother. It just doesn't make sense.
Whatever the reason, the change in Susan's testimony did make a difference. On March 16th, the jury found Susan Grund guilty of first-degree murder.
Everyone was just very elated. The county police, prosecutors, lawyers from everywhere that knew Jimmy.
April 15th, 1994. A month after she'd been convicted of murdering her husband, Jim, Susan Grund was once again seated in a Peru, Indiana courtroom. It was the same courtroom Jim Grund had practiced law in as a prosecutor and defense attorney.
Jim Grund worked hard for his community and was a key player in the community.
And it was Jim's prominent position in Peru that, according to friend Bruce Embry, attracted Susan in the first place.
She wanted to be things that she was not, and she relished the role of being the wife of a lawyer.
It was a role Susan had lucked into 10 years earlier when she'd arrived in Peru broke, pregnant, and alone. But as Peru learned that afternoon at her sentencing hearing, those weren't the only reasons Susan had returned home.
Everything about Susan's past, for the most part, was not fair game until sentencing.
Jim Grund had known all about Susan's legal trouble back in Oklahoma, but it was only after she'd been convicted of his murder that the jury learned of Susan's record.
We as observers and the jury learned she had pled no contest to the severe beating of a stepchild.
The son of her third husband never recovered from the injuries he'd received at Susan's hands.
The ambulance and stuff had to come, and it just seemed like he wasn't right after that.
Susan had fared better, receiving only probation for the offense. But there'd be no escape this time. That afternoon, after receiving the jury's recommendation, the judge sentenced Susan to 60 years in prison.
The presumptive sentence at the time was 40 years. 20 could be added for aggravating circumstances, and the judge gave her the maximum sentence based on the prior felony conviction and the brutality of it.
Although according to son Jacob, despite pleading no contest, Susan has never admitted guilt in regards to the old child abuse charge. Barely more than a toddler when he witnessed his stepbrother's beating, Jacob recalls once asking his mother about it.
Years down the road, I told her that I remembered this stuff.
At the time, according to her son, Susan denied the beating ever occurred.
She told me that he was a very clumsy boy. I know all boys are clumsy, but these were bad.
Today, after serving over a decade in prison for murder, she still denies shooting her husband.
I did not kill my husband. I'm not saying that I didn't do wrong when I hid the gun, but that was wrong. But while I'm sitting in prison, somebody's out there free.